Abigail Reed hit the frozen ground so hard her palms split open on the ice. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply lay there in the snow for one long, terrible second, her suitcase tumbling past her into the street, her coat half torn from her shoulder, and she stared up at the gray Montana sky, like a woman who had finally run out of ways to survive. The whole town of Red Hollow watched, and not one soul moved. Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart beating faster, please take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Drop your city in the comments below. I read every single one, and I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's get back to Abigail, because what happens next on that frozen street is something none of us will forget. The stagecoach had dropped her at the edge of Red Hollow just after noon, and Abigail had known the way. A woman who has been through enough always knows that she was not going to be welcomed here. She had felt it in the air the moment the wheels stopped turning. That particular stillness that falls over a small town when a stranger arrives, and the stranger is a woman traveling alone. No husband beside her. No children clinging to her skirts. Just a worn leather suitcase, a good wool coat that had seen better days, and eyes that carried the kind of quiet that only comes from a person who has learned not to expect kindness. Red Hollow, Montana territory. In the winter of 1883 was not a place that offered second chances. It was the kind of town that had survived on stubbornness and cold weather, and the belief that a person's reputation was the most important thing they owned. And Abigail Reed, according to the letter that had preceded her arrival by 3 full days, did not have a reputation worth the paper it was written on. She had told herself on the long, frozen ride through the Bitterroot foothills that it wouldn't matter. That people who didn't know her couldn't hurt her the way people who did know her had hurt her. She had told herself that all she needed was one room, 1 week of warmth, and enough distance from St. Louis to breathe again. She had been wrong about all of it. The Mayfield Inn sat in the center of Red Hollow's main street, like a woman who knew she was the finest thing around and wanted everyone to notice. It had curtains in the windows, and a painted sign, and a porch that in summer probably held rocking chairs. In February, it held only Clara Mayfield herself, a tall, broad-shouldered woman in her 50s with iron gray hair pinned so tight it pulled the skin at her temples, and the expression of someone who had already made up her mind. Abigail had climbed those porch steps with her suitcase in one hand and her coin purse in the other. "I'd like a room," she had said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced keeping it that way. Clara Mayfield had looked at her the way a person looks at something they've found on the bottom of their boot. "I know who you are," Clara said. Abigail had felt the words land in her chest like stones. "Ma'am, I don't believe we've—" "I received a letter." Clara's voice carried easily across the porch, across the street, into the ears of the 3 men standing outside the general store, and the 2 women who had slowed their walking without stopping entirely. From a Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore of St. Louis, Missouri. She wrote to every innkeeper along the northern route. A pause deliberate as a knife being drawn. She wanted to be sure women like you were not given shelter in decent establishments. Abigail's hand tightened on her suitcase handle. "Whatever that letter says, it says you destroyed a marriage." Clara's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The street had gone very quiet. "It says you carried on with a married man of standing for nearly 2 years. It says that when his wife found out, the shame of it broke him, and that he put a gun to his head 3 months later and left behind a widow and 4 children. The words were a slap. They were meant to be. That is not—" Abigail started. "I don't care," Clara said, and those 3 words spoken without heat or particular cruelty were somehow worse than anything shouted. "I don't care what your version of it is. I don't care what you have to say for yourself. What I care about is that decent people sleep in my inn, and you are not decent people. You are not welcome here. You are not welcome anywhere in this town." Abigail stood very still on that porch. She was 31 years old. She had survived things that would have flattened women made of lesser material. She had survived the year she'd spent nursing her mother through a sickness the doctors had no name for. She had survived being a woman alone in a city that had no patience for women who were alone. She had survived Charles Whitmore and everything that came after the accusations. The whispers, the complete and systematic dismantling of every small piece of security she had ever built for herself. She thought she had become someone who could not be broken in public. Standing on Clara Mayfield's porch with the whole street listening, she discovered she had been wrong about that too. "Please," she said. The word cost her more than she had. "I have nowhere else to go. It's February. I have money I can pay. I don't want your money." Clara stepped forward, and the motion was so deliberate that Abigail instinctively stepped back, and the heel of her boot caught the edge of the top porch step. And that was when it happened. That was the moment she lost the only thing she had left, which was her footing. She went down hard, the suitcase wrenching out of her hand as she fell tumbling the 2 steps to the frozen ground below. The case hit the snow and burst open at the latch, clothes spilling out into the gray slush, a comb and a small mirror, sliding across the ice, a ribbon her mother had given her unfurling in the cold air like something surrendering. For 1 second, one long suspended second, Abigail Reed lay on the frozen ground of Red Hollow's main street and stared up at the winter sky. She did not scream. She had learned a long time ago that screaming only gave people the satisfaction of knowing they had reached you. She heard Clara Mayfield say something from the porch above her, something about good riddance, and she heard a low murmur from the street. Not shock, not sympathy, just the particular sound of people who have just witnessed something unpleasant and are already deciding it was the right thing to happen. She pushed herself to her knees. Her palms were bleeding where the ice had split the skin. She started gathering her things from the snow, the clothes, the comb, the small mirror, and she kept her head down because the one thing she would not give them, the one thing she had left to protect, was the sight of her face in this moment. That was when the shadow fell over her. She had expected another voice like Clara's. Another verdict delivered from above. She tensed fingers closing around the ribbon her mother had given her, preparing herself for another blow. But the voice that came was quiet. Not soft quiet. There is a difference. Soft is apologetic. Quiet is certain. "Ma'am." She looked up. He wasn't particularly tall. He wasn't the kind of man who needed to be. He was lean and weathered in the way that men who work outside in Montana winters tend to be, with dark eyes and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days. And he was crouched down in the snow beside her things, and he was picking them up, carefully. Without being asked, he folded the blouse that had tumbled out of her case with the same deliberate attention a person gives to something that matters. He retrieved the small mirror and placed it gently into the suitcase. He picked up the comb. He didn't look at her like she was a scandal. He looked at her like she was a woman in the snow who needed her things picked up. Abigail Reed, who had not cried in 4 months, who had survived Charles Whitmore's death and Eleanor Whitmore's vendetta, and the loss of her position and her lodging and every friend she'd thought she had, felt something crack in the middle of her chest. "I don't need help," she said. Her voice didn't waver. She was proud of that. "No," he agreed, setting the last of her belongings into the case and latching it carefully shut. "Reckon you don't." He stood holding the suitcase. His eyes were steady and without pity, which was the thing she realized later that made her able to bear them. "But I've got a spare room." She stared at him. "I'm sorry. Turner Ridge, my ranch." He tilted his head slightly toward the mountain road north of town. "It's about 4 miles up. Road's not easy in this weather, but my horse can manage it." He paused. "The room's dry and warm. You'd have it to yourself." From above them, Clara Mayfield's voice cut down from the porch. "Wyatt Turner, don't you dare." He didn't look up at her. "Clara," he said, his voice carrying without effort. "I'm not speaking to you right now." A murmur ran through the small crowd that had gathered, a sound of genuine surprise, the kind that only happens when someone does something completely unexpected. Abigail looked at this man, this Wyatt Turner, and tried to find the angle. There was always an angle. She had learned that too. Men didn't offer spare rooms to women with ruined reputations out of simple generosity. Men offered things because they wanted things. She had seen enough of that particular transaction to last her several lifetimes. "What do you want?" she asked, directly. She had stopped being indirect about such things 18 months ago. He met her eyes. "Nothing," he said. And then before she could push back on that, "I have a son. He's 9. He's alone at the ranch right now, and he doesn't do well alone when it gets cold. I need to get back before dark." A pause. "I'm not asking anything of you, except that you come where it's warm, instead of standing in the snow." She searched his face for the thing she was expecting to find, the thing men hid behind generosity. She didn't find it. "You'll lose standing in this town," she said. "They'll talk about you." "They already talk about me," he said mildly. "I'm not particularly worried about it." "Mr. Turner." "Wyatt? Mr. Turner?" She was not ready to give him her first name yet. She was not ready to give him anything yet. "You don't know what they said about me. What that woman said on that porch." "I heard it," he said. "And," he looked at her steadily, "and I figure a woman's past is her own business unless she decides to make it mine." She stood there in the February snow of Red Hollow's main street with her bleeding palms and her ruined suitcase and the eyes of the whole town on her back. And she looked at this weathered, quiet cowboy who had crouched down in the snow to pick up her things without being asked. And she made the calculation that her life had trained her to make the calculation of risk and trust and the probability of being hurt. And she arrived for the first time in a very long time at an answer that surprised her. 4 miles, she said. Give or take. And the road is passable. My horse thinks so. She took her suitcase from his hand. I can carry my own case. Yes, ma'am. He agreed immediately and released it without argument. She turned to face Clara Mayfield on the porch above them. The older woman was standing very straight, her expression caught somewhere between fury and disbelief. Abigail looked at her for one long moment. Then she turned away and walked with Wyatt Turner toward the North Road, and she did not look back at Red Hollow, and she did not allow herself to feel anything yet, because she had learned the hard way that hope was something you earned in small pieces, and never all at once. The horse was a roan mare named Pepper, who regarded Abigail with the measured calm of an animal who has learned not to judge. The ride was mostly silent, in the way that rides with strangers in winter tend to be. Abigail seated sideways on the saddle in front of Wyatt, because there was no alternative, her suitcase balanced across the pommel, the cold pressing in from every direction. He rode close enough that she was sheltered from the worst of the wind without making a point of it. She noticed that. She noticed most things. After a mile or so, she said, "Why?" He didn't ask what she meant. "Because," he said, "my wife needed help once and nobody gave it to her." She waited for him to say more. He didn't. The silence that followed was not the silence of a man hiding things. It was the silence of a man who had already said the most important thing and saw no reason to add more words to it. Turner Ridge Ranch sat on a shelf of flat land high above the valley, the mountains rising steep behind it, and the Bitterroot River just visible as a dark line in the white distance below. It was not a grand place. The main house was built of squared timber, practical and low, with a barn attached by a covered walkway and a woodpile stacked higher than the porch rail. It had the look of a place that had been added to slowly over time, not planned all at once, but built piece by piece as needs required. Abigail felt something in her shoulders release slightly at the sight of it. Not comfort exactly, something more preliminary than that. They had barely dismounted before the front door flew open. The boy was small for 9. Abigail revised that estimate downward almost immediately. He might have been 8 or a young 9 with his father's dark eyes and a head of black hair that had not been properly combed since at least yesterday. He was wearing a coat that was slightly too large for him and boots that had been laced with focused but imperfect attention. He stopped dead on the porch when he saw Abigail. Then he looked at his father. "Pa, you brought someone home." "I did?" Wyatt said, leading Pepper toward the barn. "Is she staying?" "For now." The boy stared at Abigail with the frank, unguarded assessment that only children are still capable of. "Are you cold?" he asked. "Yes," she admitted. "We have a stove," he said, as though this settled everything. He stepped back from the doorway. "You can come in." The inside of the Turner house was exactly what the outside promised: practical, worn, deeply inhabited. A large iron stove in the center of the main room radiated heat that hit Abigail like something physical. A scarred wood table dominated the eating area. A pair of socks hung drying near the fire. A half-finished checkers game occupied one corner of the table, and on the floor beside the stove, a brown dog of indeterminate breed lifted his head at Abigail's entrance, decided she was acceptable, and set it back down. "That's Biscuit," the boy said, following her gaze to the dog. "He doesn't get up for strangers much, but he doesn't bite either." A pause. "I'm Noah." "Abigail," she said. And then, because she was still not sure how much to give, and to whom, Abigail Reed. Noah considered this. "That's a long name." "It is." "I'll call you Miss Abigail," he decided with the certainty of a child who has already made up his mind. "Is that all right?" She felt something in the vicinity of her sternum shift sideways in a way she didn't entirely have words for. "That's all right," she said. Wyatt came in from the barn stamping snow from his boots, and Noah immediately launched into the accounting of his afternoon. The log he'd split, the trouble Biscuit had gotten into with the chickens, a question about supper that had apparently been brewing for some time. Abigail stood slightly apart, holding her suitcase, watching them. This was a thing she had become expert at over the years, watching the way people moved around each other, reading the geometry of a relationship in the space it occupied. Wyatt listened to his son with the particular quality of attention that is not performed patience, but genuine interest. The kind of listening that says, "You matter to me," without the words being said. She had not been in a place like this in a very long time. "Miss Abigail." Noah had turned back to her. "Do you like rabbit stew? Because that's what Pa was going to make, and it's really good. He put sage in it, but if you don't like rabbit, I think we have some salt pork somewhere." "I like rabbit stew," she said. "Good." He seemed genuinely relieved. "You can sit anywhere. That's Pa's chair," he added, pointing to a specific chair by the fire. "And that's mine, but you can sit anywhere else and it's okay." She set her suitcase down. "I'll help with the cooking," she said. She looked at Wyatt. "If that's permitted." He had been watching her with his son, with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You don't have to." "I know." She moved toward the kitchen area. "I'd like to." He nodded once and moved to the stove, and they worked beside each other in the kitchen, with Noah supervising from his chair and offering opinions that were not requested, but not unwelcome. And somewhere in the rhythm of that chopping and stirring, and the smell of sage and rabbit and wood smoke, Abigail Reed's hands stopped trembling. She did not notice until they already had. Supper was the warmest thing that had happened to her in 4 months. Not because of what was said, very little was said in the way that suppers in quiet households tend to go, but because of what wasn't required. She was not asked to explain herself. She was not watched for evidence of the woman Clara Mayfield's letter had described. She was simply handed a bowl and a spoon and included in the space around the table, as though inclusion were the obvious choice. Noah asked her 7 questions over the course of the meal, which she answered as honestly as she could without giving more than she was ready to give. Had she been on a stagecoach before? Yes, many times. Had she ever been to the mountains before? Not mountains like these. Did she know how to play checkers? She did. Could she braid this last delivered with the particular hopefulness of a child who has been doing his own hair with imperfect results for some indeterminate period? "Yes," she said. "I can braid." Noah's expression was that of a person whose prayers have been answered. "Pa keeps trying," the boy said confidentially, lowering his voice in the way children do when they think they are being diplomatic. "But it's not his best thing." "No," Wyatt agreed without particular distress. "It's not." After supper, after Abigail had braided Noah's hair with the quick efficiency of a woman who had younger siblings and had not forgotten, and after the boy had been dispatched to bed with Biscuit at his feet and 2 additional blankets because the night was pressing cold against the windows, Wyatt Turner sat across the kitchen table from Abigail Reed and poured 2 cups of coffee and said nothing for a while. She waited. She was good at waiting. "The room is at the end of the hall," he said finally. "It was my wife's sewing room. I cleared it out a while back. There's a bed and a chest and a hook on the wall for your coat. Thank you. The latch on the door works, he said, and she understood that he was telling her something specific with that sentence, that he was acknowledging something without naming it the way a good man does when he wants you to know you are safe without making it a speech. She looked at her coffee cup. You should know, she said carefully, that some of what that woman said this afternoon, some of it is based in something real. He didn't move. Some of it isn't, she continued. But I'm not going to tell you it was all lies, because it wasn't. A silence. All right, he said. She looked up. That's all, just all right. You don't owe me your history tonight, he said. You've had a long day. The room's at the end of the hall. He stood collecting the coffee cups. If you need more blankets, there's a trunk in the hall closet. She watched him move to the wash basin. Wyatt. She said his name for the first time, and felt the unfamiliarity of it, this particular act of using a person's first name, the small trust it implied. He turned. Why does it not bother you? She asked. What they said. Most men weren't paying attention, he said simply. And then because he was, she was already learning a man who said the important thing and stopped, I was. She sat at that table for a long time after he had gone to his room. Sat in the warmth of that stove-heated kitchen with Biscuit at her feet, and the sound of Noah's quiet sleep from down the hall, and the snow pressing soft and white against every window. And she turned the day over in her hands, the way you turn something fragile and unexpected, something you have found in a place you never expected to find anything. She had arrived in Red Hollow that morning, with the certainty worn smooth by months of repetition that the world had decided what she was. That the letter Eleanor Whitmore had written and sent ahead of her to every town on the northern route had done its work perfectly, had arrived before she could had spoken over her, had made her reputation into a wall that no introduction and no truth and no amount of good behavior could dismantle. She had believed on that frozen road that she was going to die with no one knowing who she actually was. And then a quiet cowboy had crouched down in the snow and picked up her things. Not dramatically, not heroically, just carefully, as though they mattered because they were hers. She pressed her palm flat against the table and felt the slight sting where the ice had split the skin that afternoon, and she thought about the word spare. The room at the end of the hall. The room that had been something else, once his wife's room, a room of purpose and use and a particular woman's presence, and had been emptied and stood unused and was now being offered without conditions. I've got a spare room. She didn't believe it was spare. She was not sure sitting in that kitchen with the snow falling on the mountains outside that she believed anything in that house had been spare for very long. But she was tired. She was more tired than she had words for. And the room at the end of the hall had a latch that worked, and there were blankets in the hall closet, and tomorrow was a problem she could pick up in the morning. She rose from the table. She lifted her suitcase. She walked to the end of the hall. She did not set the suitcase down. Not that night. She set it just inside the door, within reach, the habit of a woman who had learned to be ready to leave at any moment. But she sat on the edge of the bed, and she listened to the house breathe around her. The tick of the stove cooling the sigh of the wind. The distant sound of Noah turning in his sleep, and she found for the first time in 4 months that the sound of a house at night was not a thing she needed to be afraid of. Outside, the Montana winter was building itself into something serious. The snow was deepening on the mountain road. The temperature was dropping in the way it drops in the Bitterroot Range in February, fast and committed like a door closing. Inside Turner Ridge Ranch, a lamp burned low in the kitchen, and at the end of the hall, Abigail Reed sat on the edge of a bed that had been spare until the moment she arrived, and she did not cry. Not that night, but she pressed the ribbon her mother had given her against her chest, and she breathed and she stayed. That was all. It was enough. It was, she thought, the most she had asked of any night in a very long time, to stay. She did not sleep well that first night. Not because of the cold. The room held the heat from the main stove better than she expected, but because her body had forgotten how to trust stillness. She lay on her back in the dark and listened to the house and catalogued every sound the way she had learned to do in the months since St. Louis. The creak of a board, settling the wind, shifting against the eaves. The particular quality of silence that meant no one was moving in the hall. She had been doing this so long, it had become involuntary, this nighttime accounting, this constant low-level vigilance that passed for sleep when real sleep wouldn't come. Sometime before dawn, Noah coughed. It was not a gentle sound. It was the kind of cough that grabs a person's attention from across a house, deep and rattling and wrong, in the specific way that a child's cough becomes wrong when it is something more than a cold. Abigail was sitting upright before she had made any conscious decision to move. She sat in the dark and listened, her heart doing something complicated in her chest, and she heard it again, that rough dragging sound. And then she heard Wyatt's voice, low and urgent, from down the hall. She was out of bed before she thought about whether she had any right to be. The door to Noah's room was open. Wyatt was already there, crouched beside the boy's bed, one hand on his back. Noah was sitting up, hunched forward over his own knees, his small shoulders working hard with each breath. The lamplight made his face look pale in a way that tightened everything in Abigail's chest into a single hard knot. She stepped into the doorway. Wyatt looked up. His face in that moment was the face of a man who has been frightened before by exactly this thing and has not become accustomed to it. "It happens," he said, and his voice was controlled in the careful way of a man keeping himself together through sheer practice. "In the cold nights, his chest." He stopped, started again. "It's happened before. It always passes." "How long?" she asked. "What? How long does it take to pass?" He looked at his son. Noah was still fighting for each breath, that awful pulling sound. With each inhale, his eyes half closed with the effort of it. Sometimes an hour, sometimes more. Abigail was already moving. She went to her suitcase, which she had brought to Noah's doorway by reflex, without remembering doing so, and she opened it and found what she was looking for, wrapped in a piece of flannel at the bottom beneath everything else. A small packet of dried herbs, a tin of prepared salve. Things she had carried for 2 years since the winter she'd spent helping a doctor in St. Louis before everything fell apart. "Do you have a pot?" she asked. "Something you can heat water in." Wyatt stared at her. "What are you—" "Thyme and elderflower," she said, steeped and inhaled, and the salve on his chest under a warm cloth. She held his gaze. "I've done this before. It works." A moment, one of those moments where a person decides how much they trust a stranger, and then Wyatt stood and moved to the door. "I'll get the pot." She sat beside Noah on the edge of his bed. Up close, the boy looked smaller than he had. At supper, diminished by the effort of breathing, his dark eyes fixed on her with an expression that was trying very hard not to be afraid. "Miss Abigail," he said, between labored breaths. "You're awake." "I am," she said. "Sorry," he managed. "For waking you." "You didn't wake me," she said, which was almost true. "I was already awake." She pressed the back of her hand to his forehead, warmer than she liked, not as bad as she feared. "I need you to sit up a little straighter for me, Noah. Like you're trying to be tall." He straightened gamely, even in the middle of struggling to breathe, and something about that specific bravery, that small, effortful dignity, went straight into the center of her chest and lodged there. "Good," she said. "That's exactly right." By the time Wyatt came back with the water, she had the herbs ready. She directed him with the same quiet authority she had learned in those months working beside the doctor, not loud, not demanding, just clear. He followed her instructions without question, and she registered that too. Filed it somewhere. This man who could take direction from a woman he'd known for fewer than 12 hours when his son's breathing was at stake. The steam helped within 20 minutes. The rattling in Noah's chest loosened its grip gradually, reluctantly, and his breathing evened out by degrees until it was only effortful and not alarming. The salve went on his chest, the warm cloth over that, and Abigail stayed beside him, her hand moving in slow circles on his back, while Wyatt sat on the other side of the bed and said nothing. When Noah finally fell back to sleep, it happened the way exhausted children sleep, suddenly and completely. One moment fighting, and the next, gone. Abigail and Wyatt sat on either side of him in the lamplight, and neither of them spoke for a long time. "How long has he had this?" she asked quietly. "Since he was 4. Wyatt's voice was careful, contained. "His mother, my wife Ruth, she knew what to do for it. After she died, I figured it out by trial and error." A pause. "Mostly error." She looked at the sleeping boy. "He needs this done consistently when the cold comes. The herbs aren't hard to find. I can write it down for you." Wyatt looked at her across his son's sleeping form, and she saw something in his face that she recognized the expression of a person who has been managing alone for so long that the concept of help has become almost theoretical. "You do that," he said. "Not a question exactly." "I already did it," she said. "Writing it down is just the next part." He looked at her for another moment with those dark, steady eyes. Then he said, "Get some sleep, Miss Reed. Morning comes early here." She went back to her room. She lay down. And this time, remarkably, she slept. Morning at Turner Ridge Ranch arrived with the smell of coffee and the sound of Noah's voice, recovered irrepressible, conducting what appeared to be an extensive one-sided argument with Biscuit about the fairness of certain household rules. Abigail lay still for 30 seconds, listening to it, before something in her chest loosened enough to feel like a smile, which surprised her considerably. She had forgotten what it felt like. Not the smile, the surprise at having one. She braided Noah's hair after breakfast again, and this time she showed him how she was doing it, her fingers working slowly, explaining each step. He watched in the small mirror she'd set on the table, with the focused intensity of a child who intends to master something. "Pa tried to learn," he said, watching her hands in the reflection. "He watched Ruth do it when Ma was alive, but he said his fingers are too big." She glanced at Wyatt across the kitchen. He was pretending to be interested in his coffee. "Your pa's fingers are fine," she said. "He just needs practice." "You could teach him too," Noah suggested with the complete lack of subtlety available only to 9-year-olds. "I could," she agreed mildly and let the subject sit there. That day she helped with what she could. She wasn't a ranch woman, she hadn't grown up with livestock or land, but she had common sense and capable hands, and she didn't stand around waiting to be assigned a task. She found what needed doing and did it. Mended a split in the kitchen curtain, reorganized the herb shelf above the stove so the labels faced outward, helped Noah with the letters he was supposed to be copying from his primer. Wyatt watched her without watching her, the particular attention of someone pretending not to pay attention, and said nothing. It was not until the afternoon, when Noah had fallen into a quiet nap, that the morning's difficult night had earned him, and Biscuit had settled across his feet like a furry anchor, that Wyatt came and found her at the kitchen table where she was writing out the herb instructions she had promised. He sat down across from her, set his coffee down, said nothing for a moment. "You're a trained nurse," he said finally. It wasn't quite a question. "Not formally," she said, not looking up from the paper. "I worked with a doctor in St. Louis for nearly a year. I learned what I could." A pause. Before that stopped being possible. She felt him take that in. "The scandal," he said. She set down her pen, looked up. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You don't have to tell me. I know." She met his eyes. "But I'm going to anyway because I'm tired of people knowing half of it and filling in the rest themselves." She folded her hands on the table. "Charles Whitmore was a patient's husband. I was assisting the doctor during his wife's confinement, her pregnancy. He was charming. I was lonely and stupid." She paused. "Not as stupid as it looked from the outside, but stupid enough. I ended it when I understood what it was." He did not take that well. Another pause. His wife found the letters he'd written. "Me letters I had tried to return to him, and that he had apparently kept. And that became the story. The story where I was the one who had pursued it, sustained it, ruined his marriage." She looked at the table. "He died 4 months later. No one will ever know if it was related or not. It doesn't matter to the people who decided it was my fault." She picked up her pen again. So that is what Clara Mayfield read in her letter. Some of it is real. The real part is that I was in a situation I should have removed myself from sooner. The rest of it is Eleanor Whitmore's grief dressed up as accusation. Silence. She waited for the shift she was used to. The moment when a man, even a good man, recalculated. Wyatt said, "My wife died because a blizzard closed the road before the doctor could get to her. It was a difficult birth. Noah lived. Ruth didn't." He looked at his coffee cup. "There are people in this town who told me God took her because I hadn't been to church regularly enough. That it was a judgment." His jaw tightened slightly. "I find that other people's explanations for tragedy are mostly about making themselves comfortable, not about the truth." She looked at him. He looked at her. "Finish your herb notes," he said. "I'm going to check on Noah." She looked back down at the paper and found that her handwriting for the next several lines was not quite as steady as the lines before them. The days that followed settled into a pattern that none of them had planned, and none of them named. Abigail helped with Noah's morning routine, the braid, the primer, the ongoing dispute with Biscuit over the ownership of specific sleeping locations. She worked in the kitchen with the efficiency of a person who had always found order calming. She wrote out careful instructions for Noah's breathing treatments and posted them on the inside of the cabinet above the stove. Wyatt brought in firewood and tended the livestock and repaired the things that needed repairing, and came in for meals and said little and noticed everything. She could feel him noticing. Not in the way she had learned to be wary of, not the heavy, calculating attention of a man deciding what a woman was worth to him, but in the way of a person trying to understand something without being intrusive about it. The third evening he came in from the barn and said, "The latch on the storm door is giving. I'll get to it tomorrow." "I fixed it this afternoon," she said. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her. "There was a loose screw," she said. "I found a screwdriver in the toolbox on the porch. It wasn't complicated." A pause. "You went through my toolbox." "I found a loose screw," she repeated. "I fixed it." Something moved in his face, not quite amusement, not quite something else, something in between that she didn't have a word for yet. "All right," he said and hung up his coat. Noah's breathing held steady through the next cold night and the night after that. Each morning Abigail administered the steam treatment as a precaution, a habit, now something they had all three settled into without discussion. Noah sitting patiently with the bowl and the cloth over his head while Abigail timed it, and Wyatt stood in the kitchen doorway with his coffee and observed with the expression of a man witnessing something he hadn't expected to witness in his own house. On the fourth morning, a rider came up the mountain road. Abigail was at the kitchen window when she saw the horse, and something tightened along her spine before she even saw who was on it. She had been waiting for this without knowing she was waiting for it. Waiting for the world she had left at the edge of Red Hollow's main street to send something up the mountain after her. The man who dismounted at the gate was heavy-set official-looking with a deputy's badge pinned to his coat. He was perhaps 40, with the particular face of a man who takes his authority seriously and has learned to lead with it. He knocked at the door with the knock of a person who expects it to be answered promptly. Wyatt answered it. "Cole," he said with the muted lack of surprise of a man who had been half expecting this too. Deputy Cole Mercer stood on the porch and looked past Wyatt into the house, and his eyes found Abigail at the kitchen table immediately with the directness of a man who had come specifically looking for her. "Wyatt," he said, "heard you brought someone up from town." "I did." "People are talking." "People always are." Mercer shifted his weight. "Can I come in?" A beat. Then Wyatt stepped back from the door. Mercer came in and took off his hat and looked at Abigail with the measuring attention of law enforcement. "Miss Reed," he said. "Cole Mercer. I'm the deputy here in Red Hollow." "I know what a badge means," she said pleasantly. Something flickered at the corner of Mercer's mouth, not quite a smile. He turned to Wyatt. "There's some folks in town with concerns. Clara Mayfield in particular." "Clara Mayfield always has concerns," Wyatt said. "Doesn't usually need a deputy for them. She's got the Reverend involved now." Mercer said it carefully, watching Wyatt's face. And a few of the merchants. They're saying having a woman of Miss Reed's character up here alone with your boy." "Noah's character," Wyatt said, and his voice had gone very quiet, "is the business of exactly one person in this valley, and that person is me." "Wyatt, is there a law she's breaking, Cole?" A pause. "No," Mercer said. "Is there a law I'm breaking?" Another pause. "No." "Then we're done with that part of the conversation." Wyatt pulled out a chair. "You want coffee?" Mercer sat down looking slightly wrong-footed, which Abigail suspected was not a feeling he was accustomed to. He accepted the coffee. He looked at the herb notes pinned to the cabinet. He looked at the braided sewing basket on the counter that Noah had apparently adopted as Biscuit's official toy storage. "Noah sleeping better?" he asked, and his voice had lost some of its official edge. "Yes," Wyatt said. Mercer looked at Abigail. Something in his expression shifted, not softened exactly, but became more complex. "You know medicine," he said. "Some," she said. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I'm not here to make your life difficult," he said, and she heard the grain of truth in it. This was a man doing a job he'd been pressured into, not a man with a personal grievance. "But I want you to understand that Clara Mayfield is not going to let this rest. She has a sense of how things ought to be in this town, and she's not quiet about it." "I noticed," Abigail said. "She'll make it hard for Wyatt." Mercer said it directly, and she gave him credit for that. His business in town. Noah's the boy has friends in town, goes to the social gatherings. If Clara decides to make this a point of principle, Cole. Wyatt's voice, quiet, final. "I've made my decision." A silence between the two men. The specific silence of people who have known each other long enough to have had this kind of silence before. Then Mercer stood put on his hat. "All right," he said. He looked at Abigail one more time. "I'll try to settle Clara down." "Thank you," she said, because she meant it, and because thanking a person for a practical courtesy costs nothing. He nodded. He went. Abigail sat at the kitchen table after the sound of his horse faded down the mountain road, and she looked at Wyatt, who was looking at his coffee. "You should consider what he said," she told him. Wyatt looked up. "About Noah. About your standing in town." She kept her voice steady. "I don't want to be something that makes your life harder. I can—" "Stop," he said. She stopped. "I told you when you got in the saddle," he said. "I'm not particularly worried about it." That was before Clara involved the Reverend. "Abigail." He said her first name for the first time. She felt it land with a specificity that made her go very still. "I've been managing Clara Mayfield and the Reverend and the opinion of this town for 3 years without any help. I reckon I can manage it a while longer." She looked at him. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. And that was the end of it, or should have been. But that evening after supper, after Noah was in bed, she was washing the dishes, and she became aware that her hands were shaking again. Not from cold, not from fever, from the accumulating weight of kindness. From the realization arriving slowly and terribly that she had been a person who braced for impact for so long that she did not know what to do with the absence of a blow. Every moment that passed without something being taken from her every morning, she woke in that room and found it still there. The warmth, the boy's voice, the quiet certainty of a man who kept his word was a moment that cost her something she couldn't name. It was harder, she was discovering, to receive kindness than to survive cruelty. Cruelty she knew the shape of. She had strategies for it. Kindness had no shape, she recognized, no edge she could brace against, and it was undoing her in ways that Clara Mayfield's fury never had. She set down the dish, pressed both hands flat against the edge of the wash basin. "Miss Abigail," Noah's voice from the hallway. She had thought he was asleep. She turned. He was standing in the hall in his nightshirt holding Biscuit's ear for comfort in the way he did when something had woken him, his dark eyes large in the lamplight. "I heard you stop washing," he said, "and then you didn't start again." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, Come here." He padded across the kitchen floor and stood beside her, looking up. "Are you sad?" he asked with the direct accuracy of children. "A little," she admitted. "Because of the lady in town." "Not because of her," she said. Which was true. It wasn't Clara Mayfield making her hands shake. It was a spare room and a braided ribbon, and a man who said her name like it was something worth saying. "Pa gets sad sometimes," Noah said, in the tone of a person sharing important information. "He goes out to the barn and stays there for a while. He says it helps to be around the horse." A pause. "I don't think you'd like the barn as much." A sound came out of her, something between a breath and a laugh. "Probably not," she agreed. "You could stay in the kitchen," he offered generously. "I'll sit with you." And so they sat together at the kitchen table. Abigail and Noah and Biscuit settled between their feet, while the Montana night pressed cold against the windows, and the stove ticked low and warm. Noah told her about his mother, in the careful way that children tell things they have been carrying alone for a long time. Small pieces offered, slowly watching to see if they will be held with the right kind of care. Ruth Turner had made the best cornbread he'd ever eaten. She had laughed loudly and unexpectedly. She had called him my mountain boy. She had smelled like cedar and pine soap. She had been sick for a long time before she wasn't there anymore, and he had not entirely understood the transition even now. Abigail listened with her whole self, the way she'd learned to listen in the doctor's office, the way that says every word is important. She did not offer easy comfort or fix the places where his sentences broke. She just held the weight of what he was giving her and did not put it down. When he finally ran out of words, he leaned sideways against her arm and was asleep in 3 minutes, the way exhausted children are. She sat very still and did not move him. Wyatt found them that way when he came out for water. An hour later, his son asleep against the arm of a woman who had been a stranger 4 days ago. One hand resting very gently on the boy's head, her eyes open and distant in the lamplight, turned toward something far away that Wyatt could not see, but somehow recognized. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment. He did not say anything, but he got a blanket from the hall closet and set it on the table beside her without touching her. And then he went back to his room, and Abigail looked at the blanket and understood without words being necessary that she had just been told something important. The days continued. The pattern held, the herbs, the primer, Biscuit's ongoing territorial disputes, the three of them building without naming it something that operated like a household, something that had a rhythm and a grammar and an unspoken set of rules that all of them were following without having agreed to them. On the 7th day, there was a second visitor. This one did not knock with a deputy's authority. This one knocked with the small, tentative tap of a person who is not sure she is welcome. Abigail opened the door to find a young woman she did not know, perhaps 25, dark-haired, holding a cloth-covered basket. "Miss Reed," she said. Abigail said yes. "I'm Margaret Hale. My husband, he farms the valley below Wyatt's. We heard—" She stopped, pushed forward. "My youngest has the same breathing trouble your boy that Noah has. I was wondering—" She thrust the basket forward slightly, a nervous gesture. "My husband made preserves. I thought maybe if you had a moment." Abigail looked at her, looked at the basket, and she stepped back from the door and said, "Come in, I'll put on water." She did not tell Wyatt about the visit until supper. When she did describing the young mother's child, the symptoms, the straightforward treatment she'd walked Margaret Hale through for 45 minutes at the kitchen table, something happened to Wyatt's face that she wasn't sure she had words for. It was the expression of a man watching something he had hoped for but not counted on. "She came all the way up the mountain road," he said. "Yes." "In this weather." "Yes." A pause. "Her son is worse off than Noah. She's been managing it alone." Wyatt looked at his coffee, then at her. "You're going to help her." "I already started," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There'll be more of them." She looked at him. He looked back. "This valley," he said, "there are families up here who don't go into town much in winter, who do without mostly, who have for years." He paused. If word gets around that there's someone at Turner Ridge who knows medicine. I'm not a doctor, she said. No, he agreed. But you knew what to do for Noah, and for Margaret Hale's boy. He turned his coffee cup slowly. Sometimes that's enough. She sat with that for a moment. Clara Mayfield will not like that, she said. No, he said. She won't. The look they shared across that table carried more than either of them put into words. It carried the weight of Clara's letter, and Eleanor Whitmore's vendetta, and the frozen street in Red Hollow, and the spare room and the latch that worked, and Noah sleeping against her arm, and Margaret Hale's nervous knock at the door. It carried the specific weight of two people building something between them that neither of them had planned, and neither of them knew quite what to call yet. More coffee, Wyatt said. Yes, she said. He poured it. Their hands were close on the table, but did not touch. The stove was warm. Outside, the snow was doing what snow in Montana does in February, which is commit to itself entirely, and the mountain road was getting harder by the day. Neither of them mentioned it. Neither of them mentioned what that meant. The road, the weather, the quiet way that circumstances were making a decision that neither of them had quite made yet out loud. But that night, for the first time in 7 days, Abigail Reed did not set her suitcase within reach of the door. She left it in the corner of the room. It was a small thing. It was not small at all. The suitcase stayed in the corner for 3 days before Abigail noticed she had stopped looking at it. That was how she knew something had shifted, not the leaving of it there, but the forgetting. She had spent 4 months with one eye always on whatever bag or case held her essentials, the way a person keeps one hand on a door that might need to be opened quickly. And then, one morning, she walked past the corner of the room without her eyes moving to it at all, and she stopped in the hallway and stood very still, and understood that her body had made a decision her mind hadn't caught up to yet. She wasn't sure whether that frightened her or not. She was still working that out when the second wave of visitors started coming. Margaret Hale had talked. Of course, she had a mother whose child breathes easier, doesn't keep that to herself, not in a valley where families spend the worst winter months isolated, and managing what they can't fix, because there is no one close enough to fix it. By the end of the second week, Abigail had seen 4 more families at the kitchen table of Turner Ridge Ranch. A woman whose husband had a wound on his leg that wasn't healing right. A man who came alone and said very little, but showed her his youngest daughter's rash, with the careful shame of a parent who has been worrying about something for too long. An older couple who had heard about the herbs and wanted to know if she had something for joints that ached in the cold. She helped all of them. She wrote things down. She sent them home with what she had and instructions for what to find at the general store in town, and she started keeping a list of what she was running low on, because her supply, which had felt adequate for a single person moving through the world, was not adequate for a valley full of people who had been doing without. Wyatt came in from the barn one afternoon to find her at the kitchen table with her list and 2 empty herb tins and the expression of a person working out a problem. "I need to go into town," she said without looking up. He set down the rope he'd been carrying. "All right." "I know what that means," she said. Now she looked up. "I know what it means for you. For people to see you riding in with me." "I've been seen with worse," he said, and then something crossed his face, a quick recognition that the sentence had landed wrong, and he said, "That came out." "I know what you meant," she said, and she did. "I'm going anyway. I need supplies." He looked at her for a moment with those steady dark eyes. Then he said, "I'll hitch the wagon." They rode into Red Hollow on a Thursday morning with Noah between them on the wagon bench, which had been Noah's unilateral decision, communicated through the simple method of climbing up before anyone suggested otherwise. He sat with his shoulders squared and his chin slightly lifted in the manner of a child who has made himself into a statement on purpose, and Abigail looked at him and felt something pull hard in her chest. Red Hollow watched them arrive. She felt the watching before she could see the watchers, that prickling awareness of eyes that she had developed in the months since St. Louis. People on the main street found reasons to slow down. A woman coming out of the dry goods store stopped on the step and stared without bothering to pretend she wasn't staring. Wyatt tied the wagon in front of the general store and climbed down and offered his hand to help Abigail down without looking around at any of it, and she took his hand briefly, practically, and stepped down. And then Noah vaulted off the side of the wagon because he was 9 and vaulting was preferred, and the three of them walked into the store together. Frank Adler, who ran the general store, was a small man with a large mustache and the cautious expression of someone who spends his days trying not to take sides. He looked at Abigail. He looked at Wyatt. He looked at Noah, who was already examining the penny candy with focused intent. "Morning, Wyatt," he said, and after a beat that was slightly too long, "Ma'am." "I have a list," Abigail said, and put it on the counter. He read it. His eyebrows went up slightly at the medicinal items, the volume of them, the specificity. "This is quite a lot of—" "I know," she said. "Do you have it?" He had most of it. He didn't have 2 things which he could order from Missoula if she could wait 2 weeks. She said she could wait, and he wrote it down with the careful attention of a man who has decided that commerce is more straightforward than opinion. They were still at the counter when Clara Mayfield walked in. The bell above the door announced her. Abigail knew who it was before she turned around. She recognized the particular quality of silence that followed Clara Mayfield into any room she entered, the way sound rearranged itself around her. Noah looked up from the candy. Wyatt went still beside her. Clara was not alone. She had the Reverend with her, a thin man named Aldrich, who had the look of someone who has been convinced he is right about everything for so long that doubt has become physically impossible. He looked at Abigail the way people look at things they have already categorized. "Wyatt?" Clara said. She did not look at Abigail, which was Abigail recognized its own kind of statement. "I'd like a word." "You can have several," Wyatt said pleasantly. "Frank's in the middle of helping Miss Reed with supplies." The deliberate use of the title. Abigail noticed it. She suspected Clara noticed it too from the slight tightening around the older woman's jaw. "What I have to say concerns Miss Reed," Clara said, still not looking at her. "Then say it to her," Wyatt said. A beat of silence. Then Clara slowly turned her eyes to Abigail. They were sharp eyes, Abigail noticed. Not stupid, not purely cruel. They were the eyes of a woman who had built something in this town and believed in it, and was afraid of what might undo it. Abigail had spent enough time in the last 2 weeks thinking about Clara Mayfield to have arrived at a reluctant understanding of her, which was not the same as forgiveness, but was something adjacent to it. "You've been seeing patients," Clara said. "I've been helping neighbors," Abigail said. "You are not a doctor." "I know that. You have no license, no training." "I have training," Abigail said quietly. "Not a license. There's a difference." She kept her voice even. "Margaret Hale's son is breathing better. Tom Briggs's leg wound is healing. I used sound practice and clean supplies and wrote everything down so the families can continue the treatment themselves." She paused. "I charged nothing." Something moved in Clara's face, a complication she hadn't expected, which Abigail could see her working to set aside. "That doesn't change what you are." "Clara," Wyatt said, and his voice had changed in a way that made the room go attentive. "I've listened to you for as long as I'm going to listen. You want to stand in Frank's store and tell a woman who has been helping families in this valley that she shouldn't be here, that's your choice. But you're going to do it out loud in front of Frank and the Reverend and my son, and then everyone in this town is going to know exactly what you said and why." He let that sit for a moment. "So I'd think about whether that's the conversation you want to have." The Reverend cleared his throat. "Now, Wyatt, no one is suggesting—" "Reverend Aldrich," Abigail said, and something in her voice, some quality of quiet, complete authority, made him stop. "Do you believe in the work of healing?" He blinked. "Of course." "Then we have no disagreement," she said simply. She picked up her parcels from Frank's counter. She looked at Clara Mayfield one more time, and this time she didn't look away. First, didn't lower her eyes, didn't give her the thing she was waiting for. She held the woman's gaze for 3 full seconds, and then she said, "Good day, Mrs. Mayfield," and walked to the door, and Wyatt followed. And Noah, who had been watching all of this with enormous eyes, grabbed a paper sack of penny candy and put a coin on the counter and followed his father out. On the wagon bench going home, Noah said, "You didn't yell." "No," Abigail said. "I thought you might." "Would that have helped?" He considered this seriously. "Probably not." A pause. "Pa never yells either." Wyatt said nothing, but something shifted at the corner of his mouth. The real storm, the one that would change everything, arrived on a Tuesday. It did not announce itself the way the smaller weather had. It came in the way that the worst things come quietly at first, almost politely, a darkening of the sky in the late afternoon that Wyatt noticed and said nothing about for an hour, because he was hoping he was wrong. He wasn't. By supper, the wind had picked up into something with conviction. By the time they'd cleared the table, it was a serious voice against the walls. By 8 o'clock, it was a blizzard, not the manageable Montana kind that you button down against and wait out, but the kind that turns the world outside into a single white roar, and makes the house feel very small and the distance between you and everything else feel very large. They had all three stayed in the main room, which was warmer. Wyatt feeding the stove at intervals, and Abigail reading to Noah from a novel she'd found on the shelf, an adventure story that Noah had heard before and still insisted on, which she understood, because familiar stories in storms feel like anchors, and the hours passed in that way. That hours in storms pass when you are warm and together, and trying not to think about the alternative. Noah fell asleep on the floor with Biscuit sometime around 9, and Abigail set the book down and looked at Wyatt across the sleeping boy, and Wyatt looked back at her, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Wyatt said, "He's going to want to go check on Pepper in the morning." "He'll ask you to let him go alone," she said. "He told me he does that sometimes. Checks on the horse by himself when the weather is bad." Wyatt nodded. "He likes feeling useful." "He is useful," she said. "He's been useful to me since I got here." Something in Wyatt's face did what it sometimes did when she said something he hadn't expected, went briefly unguarded, opened slightly before closing again, in the careful way of a man who has learned to manage what he shows. "He doesn't have many people who tell him that," Wyatt said. "That he's useful. I try, but—" He stopped. "I'm better at showing it than saying it." "He knows," she said. "How can you tell?" She looked at the sleeping boy. "Because he's not afraid," she said. "Children who aren't told they matter are afraid in a particular way. Noah isn't afraid. He's just brave in the way that comes from being sure of someone." Wyatt was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Ruth used to say things like that. Exact and right." He said it as a simple statement of fact, but she heard what was underneath it, the gap a person leaves in a house, the specific shape of an absence. "She would have liked you," he added, and then looked at the stove as if he'd surprised himself. She didn't fill the silence. She had learned that some silences were not fulfilling. After a while he said, "Get some sleep. I'll sit up a bit." She went to her room. She lay down. She listened to the storm do what the storm was doing, which was insisting loudly on its own existence, and she thought about what he had said. She would have liked you, and she pressed her hand flat against her sternum and felt the complicated weight of it, and did not try to simplify it into something more manageable. She was asleep when the sound reached her. She came up out of sleep fast, the way she always did, already listening before she was fully awake. The storm was still going. Something else, a door, she thought. The sound of a door, and then not the sound of anything that should have followed. She was out of bed and in the hall in seconds. Wyatt's door was open. He wasn't in it. She went to the main room. Noah's blanket was on the floor. Biscuit was at the front door, pressing his nose to the gap at the bottom, making a sound low in his throat. Her heart stopped for one complete second. She grabbed her coat from the hook by the door, and she was outside before she'd finished putting it on, and the storm hit her like a physical thing, the wind and the cold and the white blindness of it, and she could see almost nothing, just the faint yellow square of the barn light to her left and the absolute white of everything else. "Noah!" She didn't know how loud she was yelling. The wind took her voice and did whatever it wanted with it. She heard Wyatt before she saw him coming from the direction of the barn, moving fast. He grabbed her arm and she grabbed his, in return, automatic, and they stood in the howl of the storm facing each other. "He's not in the barn," Wyatt said. His voice was controlled, but she could hear what was under it, the specific, terrible fear of a parent. "Pepper's stall is open." The horse. Noah had gone for the horse. Which direction would he have taken her? She demanded. Wyatt's jaw was tight. "There's a secondary shelter, about a quarter-mile up the ridge. I've taken Pepper there before when the main barn floods. He's seen it. He was already turning. I know the way. I'm coming with you." "Abigail." "I am coming with you," she said. And something in her voice ended that conversation permanently, and he took one look at her face and nodded once, and they went. The quarter-mile in that storm was not a quarter-mile. It was a different kind of distance entirely, the kind that's measured in effort and endurance, and the specific stubbornness of two people who are not going to stop regardless of what the weather decides to do. Wyatt went first, breaking the worst of the wind. She stayed close, one hand on his arm, when the gusts peaked, and he led her without comment. They found the trail by feel more than sight, by the particular way the ground changed under their feet that Wyatt navigated on instinct and memory. She trusted that instinct completely, which she registered somewhere in the back of her mind as notable. She trusted this man's instinct completely, in a blizzard on a mountain, 3 weeks after meeting him in the snow of a street where he crouched down to pick up her belongings. The shelter was a lean-to structure against the rock face of the ridge, barely visible in the storm's white noise. Pepper was inside it. Noah was not. Wyatt's hand tightened on her arm. "He was here," Wyatt said, reading the horse, reading the straw, reading the evidence. "Pepper made it in, but the door's been open. He might have gone looking for—" "There." She grabbed his arm. "Look, down the slope. A shape in the white that was not white, a dark shape too still. And beside it, another shape, and that second shape resolved itself as they moved closer into the shape of a horse that was not Pepper, and the shape beside it resolved into a man who was face down in the snow. They reached him in under a minute. Wyatt turned him over. Deputy Cole Mercer. His face was chalk white, his lips going blue at the edges. His right leg was at an angle that legs don't go at, naturally broken. She could see it immediately, the way it sat wrong against the snow. "He must have come up the road," Wyatt said, voice tight. "In the storm. Horse threw him." "And Noah where was?" "Here." The voice was small and shaking, and directly above them, and she looked up to see Noah wedged against the shelter's outer wall, arms wrapped tight around himself, white-faced and trembling, but alive, completely alive, and the rush of relief that went through her was physical, like water, like warmth. "I found him," Noah said through chattering teeth. "I was trying to keep him. I didn't want to leave him." "You did right," Wyatt said, and he was already moving toward his son, and the way he gathered that boy against him without ceremony, without a word. Except that first one, "you did right," was the kind of thing that goes into a person and stays. She was already at Mercer. She had his leg assessed and her coat off and folded under it for stability before she'd fully thought through the decision, working on the automatic efficiency of someone whose hands know what to do when her mind is still catching up. His pulse was present but shallow. The cold was the real danger now, more immediate than the break. "We need to get him inside," she said. "Both of them inside, now." "The lean-to," Wyatt said. "It'll do for now." They worked fast. Wyatt half carrying Mercer while Abigail supported the broken leg. Noah guiding them with his hands on Wyatt's back. Biscuit, who had apparently followed them from the house, appearing out of the storm, to press against Noah's side with the faithfulness of a dog who understands that this is not the moment to be anywhere else. Inside the lean-to, with Pepper's warmth and the relative quiet of walls on 3 sides, she worked on Mercer while Wyatt held him still and Noah held the lamp. Her hands were sure. They had to be. She splinted the leg with what she had strips of her coat, lining 2 pieces of wood from the lean-to wall, and packed the cold from his core with their combined body heat. And she talked to him while she worked a low, continuous voice, which was as much for Wyatt and Noah as for the half-conscious man. "He's going to be all right," she said firmly as fact. You're sure, Wyatt said. Not a challenge. A question from a man who needed the answer. I'm sure, she said. The leg is a clean break. He's cold but not critical. We just need to hold his temperature. She looked up at Wyatt across the lamplight. You need to get Noah back to the house. I'm not leaving you here. Noah is shaking, she said. He needs warmth now. I'll stay with Mercer. The storm's going to start breaking. They always ease around this hour. You can come back. Wyatt looked at her. In the lantern light, his face was doing several things at once, the calculation of a man weighing risk against risk, his son against her, his instinct to protect against the reality that she was right. Abigail, he said. Her name again in that particular way he had of saying it, that made it sound like something decided and permanent. If the storm doesn't ease, it will, she said. He held her eyes for 3 seconds. Then he stood and took Noah by the shoulder and said, Stay close to me. I want to stay with Miss Abigail, Noah said. I know, Wyatt said. She needs us to go. Noah looked at her. She nodded once. He squared his shoulders in the particular way he had that broke her heart every time, and he went. She sat with Cole Mercer in the lean-to while the storm raged its final hour, and he drifted in and out of consciousness, and she talked to keep him focused and kept her hands on the work of keeping him warm. At some point he became coherent enough to know where he was, and the first thing he said was, Turner's woman. I'm not anyone's woman, she said. No, he agreed, and even half frozen, he managed the faint ghost of something like respect. I reckon you're not. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I owe you an apology. Coming up the mountain the way I did, with the business about Clara Mayfield. You were doing your job, she said. I was doing Clara Mayfield's job, he said. Mine would have looked different, he hissed through his teeth as she adjusted the splint. That woman has run this town's opinions like her personal ledger for 20 years, and I've let her mostly. He looked at her directly the way the near-frozen sometimes see things clearly. You came into that town with nothing, and you put yourself between a child and a hard winter, and you asked nothing in return. I see that. She kept her hands on the work. Then see it and be quiet, she said. Save your energy. He laughed a short, pained sound. Lord, you're something. So I've been told, she said, usually not as a compliment. Wyatt came back when the storm had dropped to something a person could move through. He came with the wagon. She had no idea how he'd managed it, but he had, and they loaded Mercer into the bed with careful efficiency, and the ride back down to the house was slow and deliberate and utterly without conversation, because all three of them were past the point where words felt necessary. At the house, Noah was waiting at the door. He had on his own initiative built up the stove to maximum heat and put water on to boil, and brought every extra blanket in the house to the main room. He stood in the doorway, watching them bring Mercer in with the expression of a child who has decided he is going to be part of this and will not be redirected elsewhere. I warmed the blankets, he said. Good man, Wyatt said, and Noah stood slightly taller. They settled Mercer by the stove. Abigail worked through the rest of the night, managing his temperature, checking the splint at intervals, making the medicinal tea she had for inflammation and pain, and coaxing him to drink it in the way that requires a particular combination of authority and patience. Wyatt sat across the room with his elbows on his knees and watched her work with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one he wore when he was seeing something he hadn't expected and was deciding what it meant. Around 3 a.m, Mercer was stable enough that she let herself sit back. Wyatt brought her coffee without being asked. She took it with both hands. They sat on opposite sides of the deputy's sleeping form in the lamplight, and the quiet that comes after a crisis has passed, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Then Mercer, who they had both thought was asleep, said without opening his eyes, "You know what you have here, Wyatt?" Wyatt said nothing. "I'm just saying," Mercer continued, still not opening his eyes, "that a man should know what he has." "Cole," Wyatt said, "go to sleep." "I'm asleep," Mercer said. "I'm saying it in my sleep." She looked at the lamp. She felt Wyatt looking at her. She did not look back because she was not sure what her face was doing, and she was not ready for him to see it. But she felt it, the specific, terrifying warmth of being known. Of being in a room where someone could say, "You know what you have here," and have it mean something that was not a transaction, not a negotiation, not a thing to be afraid of. She pressed her thumb against the old cut on her palm, the one from the ice of Red Hollow's main street, healed now to a thin white line, and felt the particular weight of the last 3 weeks settle into her bones with something that was not quite peace, but was closer to it than she had been in years. Outside, the storm had spent itself entirely. The sky, if she had looked, would have been going from black to deep blue to the particular gray of almost morning. But she didn't look outside. She looked at the lamp. She looked at Noah asleep in his father's chair with Biscuit across his feet. She looked at Wyatt's hands where they rested on his knees. She thought about what Mercer had said. She thought about the lean-to and the lantern and Wyatt's voice saying her name in the dark. And she thought about the suitcase in the corner of her room sitting there untouched, not within reach of the door. She thought about how she had stopped looking at it. Cole Mercer opened one eye, looked at her, looked at Wyatt, closed it again. "Yep," he said quietly to no one in particular. "You know what you have." Cole Mercer stayed at Turner Ridge for 4 days. He did not plan to. He had planned to be helped to his horse and sent back down the mountain as soon as the storm broke and his leg had been properly seen to, which was what a man in his position did, accepted necessary aid, and removed himself before it became a debt. But the leg required what it required, and Abigail told him on the first morning, with the calm directness he was already coming to recognize as her particular style, that if he put weight on it before 48 hours had passed, she would consider it a personal insult. And he looked at her face and decided she meant it. So he stayed. He slept in the main room by the stove. Noah brought him things he hadn't asked for: a book, a cup of water, Biscuit's company, an extensive verbal report on everything interesting that had happened at Turner Ridge in the past 3 weeks, delivered with the confidence of a child who considers all news equally important. Mercer listened to all of it. He was, Abigail discovered, better with children than she'd expected. He had a straight-faced humor that Noah responded to immediately, the kind of dry delivery that treats a child as someone worth being funny for. And within half a day, the two of them had established a checkers rivalry that Noah took very seriously, and Mercer appeared to take equally seriously while losing most of the games. Wyatt watched all of this from the edges in the way he watched most things and said little. On the second day, Abigail was changing the dressing on Mercer's leg when he said without preamble, "Clara Mayfield came to my office before the storm. She kept her hands on the work." "Did she? She wanted me to find a legal reason to remove you from the county." He said it straight, the way she'd come to expect from him, no softening, no editorial, just the fact laid on the table. "Said you were practicing medicine without a license, which is the closest thing to a legitimate complaint she had. And I told her that what I'd seen was a neighbor helping neighbors, which isn't a crime in Montana Territory or anywhere else." He paused. "She didn't take that well. She rarely does," Abigail said. "She's going to escalate," he said. "I want you to know that. She's been writing letters to the county seat to the circuit judge. She's building a case, even if the case is mostly her own conviction." Abigail tied off the bandage. She sat back. She looked at Cole Mercer's face, which was honest in the way that the near-death experience of a blizzard tends to make a person honest, and she said, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you saved my leg," he said. "Possibly more than that." He held her gaze. "And because you deserve to know what's coming." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you believe I should leave?" He took his time with that. She gave it to him. "I believe," he said carefully, "that Red Hollow is a town that's going to have to decide what kind of place it wants to be. And I believe that you being here is making that decision harder to avoid." He paused. "Whether that's your problem or the town's problem, I'm not entirely sure." She thought about what he said for the rest of that day, turning it over in her mind, the way you turn a stone looking for what's underneath, for what it means for the ground that held it. That evening after supper, she asked Wyatt to walk with her to the porch. The cold was sharp and clean after the storm, the kind of cold that makes everything feel precise and real. They stood side by side and she told him what Mercer had said, all of it, including the letters, including the circuit judge, including her own question back to Mercer, about whether she should leave. Wyatt listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "What did he answer?" "He said it was complicated," she said. "That's a politician's answer." "He's a deputy," she said. "It comes with the territory." A silence. The cold pressed in from every direction. "Do you want to leave?" Wyatt asked. The question was direct in the way his questions always were, no decoration, no suggestion of what the right answer was. No pressure in the asking. Just the question laid there clean. She had been waiting for him to ask it. She had been dreading it and waiting for it in equal measure because she knew she was going to have to answer it honestly, and she wasn't sure the honest answer was safe to say. "No," she said. He didn't move. Didn't speak. Just stood there beside her in the cold. "No," she said again, because it deserved repeating. "I don't want to leave. I have not wanted to stay anywhere in a very long time, and I am aware of what it means that I want to stay here, and I am also aware that wanting something has never once in my life guaranteed that having it was a reasonable possibility." She stopped, pressed her hands against the porch rail. "I'm telling you this because you asked, and because I've decided that being dishonest with you is not something I'm capable of anymore, not in this house." Wyatt was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'm going to build up the north fence tomorrow. The storm took out 2 sections. She stared at him. "You could help me," he said, "if you want something to do." She understood that he was not ignoring what she had said. She understood, having spent a month learning the particular language of this man, that he was answering it in the only way that was real to him, not with words which could be taken back, but with tomorrow which was concrete and specific, and meant something that declarations did not. "All right," she said. "Dress warm," he said. "I know how to dress for the cold." "I know you do," he said, and went inside. She stayed on the porch for another minute in the dark and the cold, and she pressed her thumb against the healed line on her palm, and she breathed, and she did not allow herself to simplify what had just happened into something manageable, because it wasn't manageable, and she was done pretending that the things that mattered could be made smaller for convenience. Mercer left on the 4th morning, which was a clear day with good light. Wyatt helped him to his horse with the careful handling of a man who respects that another man needs to do this himself, and Mercer mounted with the grim determination of someone whose leg was going to remind him of this for weeks, and had already decided not to mention it. He looked down at Abigail from the saddle. "I'm going to do what I can with Clara," he said. "I know," she said. "It might not be enough. I know that too." He looked at her for a moment, the same look he'd had in the lean-to, that clear-eyed, storm-stripped honesty. "You're going to be all right," he said. Not a reassurance. A statement of fact from a man who had revised his assessments. "I usually am," she said. He nodded once, touched his hat, rode down the mountain. She watched him go, and then she turned around and went back inside, because the north fence wasn't going to wait, and she had said she would help, and she intended to. The news reached Red Hollow before Mercer did. This was the nature of small places. Information moved through them like weather by its own routes, faster than horses. By the time Mercer rode back into town, the story of the blizzard and the deputy and the woman at Turner Ridge, who had splinted his leg in a lean-to in the middle of a February storm, had already been told and retold, until it had the shape of something true and something larger than true simultaneously. Abigail knew none of this until Margaret Hale came up the mountain road 5 days after the storm with her youngest on her hip, and a look on her face that was complicated in all the ways that the faces of women who are about to say something difficult are complicated. She sat at the kitchen table, and she said, "People are talking." "They always are," Abigail said, which was what Wyatt always said, which Margaret noticed from the slight lift of her expression. "Different talking," Margaret said. "Not the not Clara's kind." She shifted the baby. Nan Briggs told her neighbor that Tom's leg finally healed after 2 years of it not healing, and that neighbor told someone else, and now there are women in town who are asking questions. She paused. "Good questions," Curious questions. She looked at Abigail directly. Clara's still making noise, but the room is getting smaller around her, I think. The people listening are fewer. Abigail set down her coffee cup. How many fewer? She asked. Enough that Reverend Aldrich apparently told her last Sunday that he had concerns about the Christian charity of her position. Margaret almost smiled. She didn't receive that well. Abigail looked at the table. Something was moving in her chest. Something she didn't immediately trust, because hope had betrayed her before and recently, and she was still careful with it. Don't, Margaret said quietly. Abigail looked up. Don't talk yourself out of it, Margaret said. I know that look. I wore it for a long time before things changed for me. Before I stopped telling myself that good things happening were just the quiet before the bad. She reached across the table and put her hand over Abigail's. Let it be good. Just for now. Let it just be good. Abigail looked at this woman, this practical, tired kind woman who had climbed a mountain road in winter with a baby on her hip because she thought it was worth the trip, and she felt something behind her eyes that she had been keeping back with considerable effort for several weeks. She looked at the window, pressed her lips together, nodded once. All right, she said. That was when Noah came running in from outside with the specific quality of urgency that means something has happened, not something is wrong, the difference which she'd learned to read between alarm and news. There's a wagon coming up the road, he announced. Pa can see it from the fence line. 2 people, he doesn't know who. Abigail and Margaret exchanged a look. The wagon carried Clara Mayfield and a man Abigail had never seen older official looking, with the bearing of someone accustomed to being the most important person in a room. Wyatt came in from the fence line at the same time the wagon pulled up, his expression careful and contained in the way it got when he was managing something. They all stood in the yard. Abigail, Wyatt, Margaret with her baby Noah slightly behind his father's elbow, and Clara Mayfield climbed down from the wagon with the deliberate dignity of a woman making an entrance. The man with her stayed on the wagon. He had a document case across his knees. Abigail Reed? Clara said. She was doing the not looking at her thing again, which Abigail had decided was its own particular failure of nerve. This is Mr. Gerald Foss. He's an officer of the county court. The man on the wagon nodded. Miss Reed, I've received a complaint regarding unlicensed medical practice. I'm required to deliver this notice and give you the opportunity to respond. He held out a document. Wyatt stepped forward. He took the document before Abigail could reach it. He read it with the steady attention of a man who reads things completely before reacting, which she had observed before and respected now. When he finished, he looked at Foss. This gives her 30 days to cease medical practice in the county or appear before the circuit judge, Wyatt said. That's correct, Foss said. And the judge hears these on what schedule? The circuit comes through in 6 weeks. Wyatt looked at Clara. Clara was still not looking at Abigail, which meant she was working hard at something. Clara, he said, and his voice was the quiet, certain voice that ended conversations. You've just guaranteed that this woman's name and her work in this valley will be brought before a judge in an open proceeding, where every family she's helped will have the opportunity to speak. He let that sit for one moment. I hope that's what you wanted. For the first time, something moved behind Clara Mayfield's certainty. Not doubt exactly, not yet, but the beginning of a calculation she hadn't finished. The law is clear, she said. The law, Wyatt said, is also a public proceeding, and this valley has families who will make the trip to attend. He handed the document to Abigail. Mr. Foss, thank you for the ride up. You're welcome to water your horse before you go. Foss looked at Clara. Clara looked at a point slightly above and to the left of Abigail's head. Then she said stiffly, We'll be going. The wagon turned around and went back down the mountain. The 4 of them stood in the yard and watched it go. Noah said, What does circuit judge mean? It means a man comes to listen to both sides of a disagreement, Wyatt said. And then what? And then he decides. What if he decides wrong? Wyatt looked at his son. Then we decide what to do about that." Noah appeared to find this satisfactory. He went back inside. Margaret, after squeezing Abigail's arm with a grip that said everything her words didn't, gathered her baby and went to her wagon and said she'd be back next week. Abigail stood in the yard with the document in her hand and Wyatt beside her, and she read it again, the formal language, the specific complaint, Clara Mayfield's name printed at the bottom as complainant, and she felt the old fear start its familiar climb up from her stomach. The fear said, "Here it is. Here is the thing that takes it away. It always comes." Wyatt said, "Give me that." She looked at him. He took the document. He folded it precisely. He put it in his coat pocket. "I know a lawyer in Missoula," he said. "Good man. He's handled cases before the circuit judge." He met her eyes. "This is not the end of anything." "You don't know that," she said, and her voice was steady, but only by conscious effort. "I know that you saved Cole Mercer's leg in a lean-to in a blizzard," he said. "I know you've helped every family in this valley who came to this door. I know you charged nothing and kept records and wrote down everything you did." He paused. "I know the circuit judge is a man who deals in evidence, and I know what the evidence looks like." Another pause. "Do you trust me?" The question was quiet. It was the most direct thing he had ever asked her. She looked at his face, weathered, steady, dark-eyed, the face of a man who had crouched down in the snow of a street where everyone else was standing still and picked up her things without being asked. "Yes," she said, simply. "Then let me worry about Clara Mayfield," he said. "You've got enough to carry." That night, she wrote a letter. Not to a lawyer, not to the court. She'd leave that to Wyatt and his contact in Missoula. She wrote to a woman named Dr. Vera Haynes in St. Louis, who had been the wife of the doctor she'd trained under, and who had, unlike most people in Abigail's life at that period, believed her account of Charles Whitmore without qualification or caveat. She hadn't written to Vera in months. She hadn't let herself, because writing to people who knew you from before required admitting that before still existed, that you were still the same person who had been in those circumstances, and she had been trying very hard to become someone new and hadn't wanted the reminder. She wrote now everything. The stagecoach and Clara Mayfield's porch and the frozen street and the man who had said 5 words and changed the direction of her life. The spare room and the herbs and Noah's breathing and the families coming to the kitchen table. The blizzard and the lean-to and Cole Mercer's leg and the document in Wyatt's coat pocket. She wrote it all 10 pages, the most she had written to anyone in 2 years, and when she finished, she held the letter in her hands and felt the specific weight of a life being accounted for on paper. At the bottom, she wrote, "I think I am home. I don't entirely know how to trust that, but I think I am home." She sealed it. She would post it the next time she went into town. She sat for a long time after in the chair by the window in the dark. The house was quiet around her. Wyatt's breathing somewhere down the hall. Noah's occasional sleep sound. Biscuit's soft shift against the floor. The stove ticked low and warm. Outside, the Montana winter was doing what February does when it is considering becoming March. Not softening yet, but losing some of its absolute conviction. She thought about what the next 6 weeks held. The lawyer, the proceeding. Clara Mayfield's face on the wagon, something behind her, certainty that had moved for just a moment. The families in the valley who would speak if asked. Mercer, who owed her and knew it and was the kind of man who paid his debts. She thought about what Wyatt had said. This is not the end of anything. Said it like a fact, not a comfort, which was the only way she could receive it. And then, because she was a woman who had survived by knowing herself accurately, by refusing the comfort of easy fictions, she thought about the thing she had been refusing to think about directly for nearly a month. She thought about what happened if they won. What happened if the circuit judge found in her favor, if Clara Mayfield's complaint was dismissed, if the Valley family spoke, and the evidence was what Wyatt said it was, and the law landed on the side that she had begun carefully, terrifyingly to believe it might. What happened then? Because the question was not only whether she could stay. The question was what staying meant when you had been a woman who ran. when running had been the thing that kept you alive. When stopping putting the suitcase down, actually putting it down, required a kind of trust in the ground beneath your feet that she was not sure she had learned yet. She pressed her palm flat against the windowsill. Outside, something moved in the dark. She thought it was a cloud, the moon doing what the moon does when weather moves through. And then she realized it was snow. Light, tentative, almost apologetic. The last snow of February maybe, or the first snow of March, the difference between the two being mostly a matter of how you chose to name the moment you were in. The door at the end of the hall opened. She turned. Wyatt stood in the hallway in the dark, and she had apparently made some sound, or the light under her door had told him something the way the specific small signs of this house had begun to communicate between them without either of them designing it. "You're awake," he said. "I'm awake," she agreed. He leaned against the doorframe. His face was in shadow. "You're thinking about the proceeding." "Among other things." A pause. "What other things?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What happens if it goes our way?" He was quiet too. She could feel him being quiet, the specific quality of it, the way he moved through silence like a man who had made peace with it. "I've been thinking about that too," he said. She looked at her hands on the windowsill. "And," she said. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "There's a room at the end of this hall that hasn't been spare a single day since you walked into it. I think we both know that." He paused. "I'm not asking you for anything tonight. I'm just saying that, so you know." She looked at him in the dark. At the steady shadow of him against the hallway, the deliberate stillness of a man who has said the thing he meant to say and is not going to unsay it or crowd it with more words. She thought about the suitcase in the corner. She thought about Vera Haynes's face, and the letter she'd written, and the line at the bottom, "I think I am home." "All right," she said, quietly, permanently. "Get some sleep," he said. "You too." He went back down the hall. She heard his door close, not shut exactly, left slightly open the way the doors in that house were lately, the way of a house that has stopped expecting to be locked against itself. She sat in the chair for another few minutes. Then she stood. She crossed the room. She picked up the suitcase from the corner where it had sat for 3 weeks. She carried it to the closet. She opened the closet door and set it inside against the back wall behind the winter coats. She closed the closet door. She went to bed. She slept for the first time in 4 months without listening to the house. The weeks that followed had the particular quality of time that passes when something important is coming, stretched in some moments and compressed in others, the ordinary and the charged alternating without pattern. Abigail continued her work. More families came. She kept her records with meticulous care, the kind of care that is also an argument, the kind of documentation that says, "Look at what was done here. Look at what it produced." She wasn't building a defense exactly. She was building a truth. The distinction mattered to her. Wyatt rode to Missoula and came back 2 days later with a lawyer named Everett Cross, who was small and precise and looked at Clara Mayfield's complaint with the expression of a man who has seen considerably worse and found this particular example unimpressive. He asked Abigail questions for 3 hours at the kitchen table, careful, specific, probing questions that she answered with the same careful specificity, and at the end, he stacked his papers and said, "You kept good records." "I was trained to," she said. "By whom?" she told him. He wrote it down. "Would this doctor provide documentation?" "His wife would," she said. "She was present for most of my training. She has a very good memory and very strong opinions." Everett Cross looked at her over his papers with something that was not quite a smile, but was related to one. "Good," he said. "We'll need both." He left with a list and a plan, and the particular confidence of a small man who has learned that the law used precisely is a more effective tool than size or volume. The morning after Cross's visit, Abigail was at the kitchen table writing to Vera again, a more specific letter this time, asking for documentation, explaining the situation when Noah came and sat across from her and watched her write for a minute. "Miss Abigail," he said. Are you going to have to go away?" She set down her pen. She looked at him, this boy, with his father's eyes and his mother's laugh, and the braid she'd taught him, and the breathing treatments that had become a morning ritual as ordinary and permanent as breakfast. "I don't know," she said, because she had decided that honesty was the only gift worth giving to people who trusted her with their questions. His face did something complicated. "But you don't want to," he said. "No," she said. "I don't want to. Pa doesn't want you to either," Noah said with the absolute confidence of a child who has read his father correctly and knows it. "He doesn't say it like that, but I can tell." He paused. "He looks at you the same way he looks at the ranch when he comes back from somewhere. Like he's checking that it's still there." She picked up her pen, looked at the letter, set the pen down again. "You're very observant," she said. "I know," he said without particular pride. "Just fact. Ma was observant too. Pa says I get it from her." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you think she'd mind that you're here?" The question was so quiet and so serious and so full of the specific longing of a child who misses his mother and has been carrying the question alone that it went through her like something physical. She took her time. "I think," she said carefully, "that your mother sounds like someone who loved you and your father very much. And I think people who love that completely want the people they love to be whole, to be all right." She met his eyes. "I think she'd mind very much if you weren't all right. And I think she'd be glad about anything that helped." Noah sat with that for a moment. Then he nodded once with a gravity that was entirely his father's. "Okay," he said. He slid off the chair. "I'm going to go practice the braid." He went down the hall. She listened to the sound of his footsteps. She picked up her pen, and she finished the letter to Vera Haynes, and she felt along the full length of her, through the fear and the proceeding, and the 30-day notice, and Clara Mayfield's unfinished calculation, a warmth that she did not try to make smaller or safer or more qualified than it was. She let it be what it was. She had been told once by someone who was wiser about such things than she was, that the bravest thing a person could do was stop running before they were sure it was safe. She had not believed it then. She was beginning to. The letter from Vera Haynes arrived on a Thursday, 11 days after Abigail had sent hers. It was thick. 3 pages in Vera's precise angular hand, and a 4th page that was something else entirely, a formal document signed and notarized written on the letterhead of the St. Louis Medical Association. Abigail read it standing at the kitchen table with her coat still on, because she had taken it directly from the postal rider's hand and not waited. She read it twice. Then she sat down. Noah, who had been watching her face the way children watch adult faces when something important is happening, said, "Is it good or bad?" "Good," she said. And then, because the word felt insufficient for what was in her hands, very good. Vera had written not only a character statement, but a full accounting of Abigail's training dates, procedures cases, observed skills demonstrated, signed by 2 additional physicians who had worked alongside the late Dr. Haynes, and who remembered Abigail specifically and were willing to say so in writing. The notarized document certified that Abigail Reed had received practical medical training equivalent to that of a formally licensed nurse under the supervision of a licensed physician for a period of 11 months. It was not a medical license, but it was the next thing to one. And in Everett Cross's hands, Abigail understood immediately it was going to be a very different kind of argument than Clara Mayfield had been prepared for. She rode into Missoula with Wyatt the next morning. She sat across from Everett Cross in his small, paper-stacked office and watched him read Vera's letter and the notarized document with the careful attention of a man assembling something in his mind as he reads. When he finished, he set both documents down. He folded his hands. He looked at Abigail. "Mrs. Mayfield," he said, "has made a significant strategic error." "Tell me," Abigail said. "She filed a formal complaint," Cross said, "which means this goes to a formal proceeding, which means everything you've done in that valley gets entered into the public record." He tapped the notarized document. "With this, and with the testimony of the families you've treated, you are not facing a question of guilt. You are facing a question of recognition." He paused. "There is a meaningful difference." Meaning? Wyatt said from beside her. Meaning the judge is not going to be deciding whether Miss Reed did something wrong. He is going to be deciding whether what she did should be acknowledged as legitimate practice. Cross leaned forward. I've seen this go two ways. If we bring the right voices into that room, we can push this toward the second outcome. He looked at Abigail. How many families are you certain will come? She thought about Margaret Hale climbing the mountain road with a baby on her hip. She thought about Tom Briggs's leg that had healed after 2 years of not healing. She thought about the older couple with the aching joints who had come back a second time and brought preserves. She thought about every name in the record book she kept on the shelf above the kitchen table. Enough, she said. Cross nodded once. Then we're ready. The proceeding was set for the first Friday of March. Word moved through the valley the way word does fast and specific one person to the next. The message clear the woman at Turner Ridge, who had helped their children breathe and their wounds heal, needed them to come to Red Hollow and say so in front of a judge. They came. Abigail did not know until the morning of the proceeding how many of them had decided to make the trip. She found out when she and Wyatt and Noah rode into Red Hollow and found the main street more crowded than she had ever seen it. Wagons from the High Valley farms. Horses tied along both sides of the street. Families she recognized, and some she didn't, faces that turned toward her as they arrived and did something she had not expected. They nodded. Some of them raised a hand. One woman. Older. Someone Abigail had seen only once, whose granddaughter she had helped through a fever in January, crossed the street specifically to reach her and took both her hands and said, "We're here. All of us. Don't you worry." Abigail did not trust herself to speak for a moment. She pressed the woman's hands and nodded. Noah, riding on the wagon bench between them, looked at the street full of people and then at Abigail and said quietly and with great certainty, "I told you." She looked at him. "I told you people would see," he said. "I told Pa too. He said I was probably right." Wyatt to her left said nothing, but she felt him looking at her and she looked back, and what passed between them in that look over Noah's head was something that neither of them needed to name. The proceeding was held in the town hall, which was the largest room in Red Hollow, and which was, by the time the circuit judge called the room to order, filled past comfortable capacity. People stood along the walls. Noah sat in the front row between Margaret Hale and her husband, with the focused seriousness of a child who understands he is witnessing something important. Clara Mayfield sat at one table with her written complaint, and a man from the county seat who had the look of someone who had been hired to represent a position he hadn't entirely finished forming an opinion about. Abigail sat at the other table with Everett Cross and the notarized document and her record book, and a composure she was maintaining through the specific mechanism of keeping her hands flat on the table where she could feel the wood real and solid beneath them. Judge Thomas Ware was 60, gray-haired, with the patient eyes of a man who has heard many versions of many disputes and has learned to listen for what people are not saying as much as what they are. He read Clara's complaint. He read Cross's response. He looked at Vera's document for a long time. Then he looked at the room. "I understand," he said, "that there are members of this community who wish to speak to the matter of Miss Reed's practice." What followed was 2 hours that Abigail would spend the rest of her life returning to in memory, not the words exactly, but the weight of them. Tom Briggs, who spoke carefully and slowly, because public speaking was not his gift, but who did not stop until he had said everything he intended to say about his leg, and the 2 years before it healed, and the difference after. Margaret Hale, who held her baby on her hip, and spoke with the flat certainty of a woman who has decided that clear statements are worth more than eloquent ones. 6 other families, one after another, each with their specific account: the fever, the cough, the wound, the herb, the instruction written down and followed, and the outcome that would not have been possible without the woman sitting at that table. Clara Mayfield's representative made his argument with the careful language of legal procedure, and it was not a bad argument. The licensing issue was real, the technical complaint was valid, but Abigail watched the judge's face while he listened to it, and she saw what was happening. She saw a man recalibrating. She saw a man who had walked in expecting to weigh a complaint and was discovering that the complaint was surrounded by a community that had already weighed it and arrived at a different answer. Everett Cross was precise and brief, which was exactly right. He entered Vera's document into the record. He cited 3 cases from other territories where practical medical training had been recognized in the absence of formal licensing. He noted that the individuals Miss Reed had treated were adult members of the community who had sought her assistance voluntarily, that she had charged nothing, that she had kept records consistent with medical best practice, and that the outcomes were documentable and positive. Then he sat down. Judge Ware looked at the room for a moment. Then he looked at Abigail directly. "Miss Reed," he said, "you've heard the complaint and the response. Do you wish to say anything?" Cross had told her she didn't need to, that the record spoke for itself. She had listened to this advice and decided to follow it partially, which was all she ever did with advice, which Cross had seemed to understand and accept. She stood. "Only this," she said. Her voice was steady. "I know I don't have a license. I have never claimed to have one. I told everyone who came to me exactly what I was. Someone with practical training who could help, not a doctor who could replace professional care when professional care was available." She looked at the room, not at Clara, not at the judge, at the room, at the faces she recognized. "Professional care is not always available in this valley in winter. I didn't invent that problem. I just tried to be part of a solution." She paused. "If that was wrong, I will accept whatever this court decides. But I will not accept that it was harmful, because the record says it wasn't." She sat down. Cross beside her made a small sound that was not quite approval, but was adjacent to it. Judge Ware looked at his papers for a long time. The room was very quiet. Then he said, "I'm going to take a recess." The recess lasted 40 minutes, which was 40 minutes of the most specific kind of waiting. The kind where every minute is a separate experience, where the room fills with the low sound of people managing their anticipation. Noah came and sat beside Abigail during the recess, and pressed his shoulder against her arm without saying anything, which was exactly the right thing to do, and she told him so. Wyatt stood behind them both, one hand resting on the back of her chair. Not touching her. Just there. Solid and present, and entirely without doubt, which she needed more than she had words for. When Judge Ware came back, the room went silent before he had fully seated himself. He looked at his papers. He looked at the room. He looked at Abigail. "The complaint, as filed," he said, "is technically valid. Miss Reed does not hold a license." He paused, and that pause contained enough weight to press against the walls. However, the court finds that the practice as conducted falls within the established precedent of supervised lay medical assistance, particularly in rural and frontier territories where access to licensed practitioners is limited. The documentation of training provided is substantial. The outcomes documented are positive. The community consent is evident. He folded his hands. The complaint is dismissed. The room erupted. Not loudly, not the way rooms erupt in stories where everyone cheers. The way real rooms do, with the release of held breath, and people turning to each other, and the specific sound of relief that is partly vocal and partly just the change in how everyone in the room is breathing. Margaret Hale made a sound that was half laugh and half something else. Tom Briggs reached across 2 people to grip Wyatt's arm. Noah said very quietly, but with complete conviction, "I knew it." Abigail sat very still. She had not let herself prepare for this. She had kept herself in the careful suspension of someone who knows that expectation is a vulnerability, who has learned that the moment you believe the good thing is coming is precisely the moment to brace for the alternative. And now the good thing had come, and she had no brace prepared, and she felt it move through her relief gratitude. Something vast and structureless that had no name. She was ready to put to it, and she pressed both hands flat on the table, and breathed, and did not let herself come undone in this room. Not in this room, because some things are private, even when everything around them is public. Cross was talking to her. She registered the words, "Good. Outcome, clean record. Vera's document will be useful. Going forward," and she nodded at the right intervals and said the right things, and shook his hand when it was offered. and then she stood and turned around. Clara Mayfield was standing 6 feet away. The room was moving around them, people filing out conversations, starting Wyatt fielding handshakes, and somehow in the middle of all of it, there was a still pocket, just the two of them, and Clara was looking at her. Actually looking at her. Not past her, not over her shoulder, not at the point 3 inches to her left where her gaze usually landed. At her. Abigail waited. Clara's face was doing something complicated and controlled, and underneath the control, something Abigail had not expected to see there. Not defeat Clara Mayfield was not a woman who wore defeat. Something more difficult than that. Something that looked, if Abigail was reading it correctly, like a woman who has been wrong about something for long enough that admitting it is a physical effort. "You saved Cole Mercer's leg," Clara said. Her voice was level. Whatever this was costing her, she was keeping the cost off her face. "Yes," Abigail said. A pause. "My brother lost a leg, years ago. Different situation, but the result of it." She stopped. Started again with visible effort. "I have particular feelings about men who lose limbs unnecessarily." Abigail looked at her. "I am not going to tell you I was right," Clara said, "because I can see that I was not entirely right." The precision of that "not entirely" was Clara Mayfield in miniature, and Abigail found herself almost respecting it. "But I want you to understand that my concern was genuine. This is my town. I have spent 30 years. "I know," Abigail said quietly. Clara stopped. "I know it was genuine," Abigail said. "Genuine concern and correct action are not always the same thing. I know that better than most people." She held the older woman's gaze. "I'm not asking you to like me, Mrs. Mayfield. I'm not asking you to believe I'm a good person. I'm asking—" She paused, finding the exact word. "I'm asking for the chance to be one, in front of you, over time." Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "The winter social is in 2 weeks." It was not an apology. It was not an endorsement. It was Clara Mayfield opening a door precisely 1 inch and leaving it to Abigail to decide what to do with that. "I know," Abigail said. Clara nodded once, with the barest fraction of something that was not quite warmth, but was not coldness either, and she turned and walked out of the town hall, and Abigail watched her go, and felt something shift in the air of Red Hollow, that was small and not dramatic and real in the way that only small, undramatic things are real. Wyatt appeared at her elbow. "What was that?" he asked. "I'm not entirely sure," she said. "But I think it was a beginning." The 2 weeks before the social passed in a way that felt different from the weeks before, lighter, somehow. Even though nothing about the actual work had changed. More families came to the kitchen table. Abigail wrote to Vera, again a shorter letter this time, telling her what had happened, telling her thank you in the way that words are insufficient for, but are all you have. She received a reply within 10 days that made her laugh out loud in the kitchen, which startled Biscuit and brought Noah running to find out what was funny. "An old friend," she told him. "She says she's glad." "What's her name?" "Vera." "Is she nice?" "She is formidable," Abigail said. "Which is better?" The night before the social, Abigail could not sleep. This was not the sleeplessness of fear she had learned to tell the difference by now. This was the sleeplessness of someone standing at an edge and looking out at the distance at what was below and what was beyond, and the specific vertigo of having chosen to jump. She got up. She went to the kitchen. She put water on the stove. Wyatt was already there. He was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and the expression of a man who had also been awake, and they looked at each other across the kitchen in the dark, in the specific way of two people who have been moving toward each other for months without either of them deciding to name the moving. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "No," he agreed. She sat down across from him. He poured her a cup from the pot. Their hands were close on the table. "I keep thinking," she said, "about what happens next." "Good thinking or bad thinking?" he asked. She considered. "Honest thinking." He nodded. He waited. "I keep trying to find the thing that's going to go wrong," she said. "I do it automatically. I've been doing it so long, it's just how I think. I look at something good and my mind goes straight to the way it ends. She looked at her cup. I looked at that courtroom yesterday and I thought, what if the judge rules against me? And when he didn't, I thought, what if Clara finds another angle? And when she said what she said, I thought, what if it's a strategy? What if it's not real? She looked up at him. I'm exhausted by it. By my own mind. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Ruth used to say that I thought the same way about weather. That I was always watching for the storm instead of the clear sky. He paused. She said eventually I'd have to learn to trust a clear sky for what it was. Not evidence of a storm coming, just clear. She looked at him. She was right, he said simply. She was right about most things. The kitchen was very quiet. Is this a clear sky? She asked. Her voice was steady, but only by the specific effort of someone who has decided to say the real thing. He looked at her the way he had looked at her that first night on the frozen street of Red Hollow, directly, without calculation, without the complicated overlay of agenda that she had learned to read in men's faces as a survival skill, just straight and clear and certain. It is, he said. She pressed her thumb against the thin white line on her palm. Felt it healed real, the mark of a street where she had hit the ground and a man had come and picked up her things without being asked. All right, she said. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers, just his hand, warm and certain, and not demanding anything beyond what it was. And she looked down at it and did not pull away and did not calculate and did not look for the edge where this ended. She just let it be what it was. The winter social was held at the town hall, rearranged from courtroom to celebration, with the specific efficiency of a community that knows how to use one room for many purposes. Someone had brought pine boughs. Someone else had brought a fiddle player, and the fiddle player had brought a friend with a guitar, and together they produced music that filled the room and did something to the air of it. Loosened it, shifted. It made it into a place where things that had been stiff for a while could begin to move again. Abigail stood at the edge of the room when they arrived and watched the gathering. The way she always watched gatherings, reading the room, cataloging the faces, mapping the social geography. She saw people who had been at the proceeding. She saw Tom Briggs and Margaret Hale and the older couple with the aching joints. She saw Mercer, who had his weight still slightly off the healing leg, standing near the door with his hat in his hands, and who caught her eye across the room and nodded just once with the specific gravity of a debt acknowledged. She saw Clara Mayfield across the room, who looked at her when she arrived, and did not look away, and did not smile, but held her gaze for a moment, and then turned to speak.